Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's great to see you this evening. My name is Paul Woolley. I am the CEO here at LICC. Welcome to this event, Fight Like a Christian, which sounds a little bit like a gladiatorial contest, doesn't it? We may disappoint you, though who knows? We appear, do we not, to be living in an increasingly divided and divisive culture. Check your social media feeds or read the news, and it doesn't take long to see this being played out in all sorts of highly corrosive ways. It's said that we live in a civilized society, but it's one in which civility often appears to be in short supply. So what are we to do about this? How can we disagree well? That's the focus of our evening, and this evening we're going to hear from three people from different backgrounds who have plenty of experience in dealing with conflict, with disagreement. They bear the scars. We'll hear their stories of when conflict has been handled well and when it's not been handled so well. And we'll get some help, practical help, to personally navigate disagreement as we seek to be resilient and authentic disciples of Jesus. So let me introduce our panel to you. We're delighted to be joined by our three guests this evening. The first person I want to introduce you to is Jenny Brown, who is a head teacher at Derby Cathedral School. She has worked in education for 22 years, starting as a maths teacher. She soon moved into senior leadership and helped to turn a school around that was in special measures. From there, she took her first headship, starting a new free school in Nottingham. And this year, she's gone up to Derby to head the Derby Cathedral School. And she's looking forward to helping it grow and flourish in a brand new purpose-built building. Jenny, it's great to have you with us this evening. Our second panelist is Steve Elms. Steve is the lead minister of Bookham Baptist Church, that's in Surrey. He's committed, as is the church, to growing fruitful followers of Jesus. Over the last 10 years, he's been involved in helping local churches in the Southeast engage in conversation about human sexuality and discipleship, a contentious area where different viewpoints quickly emerge. And then we're also joined by Stephen Timms, who's been MP for East Ham since 1994 and was previously leader of Newham Council. Stephen has been a government minister and now chairs the Work and Pensions Select Committee. He's been the Labour Party's Faith Envoy since 2007 and is the founding chair of the all-party parliamentary group on faith and society. And on a personal note, Stephen was one of the MPs I came across working as a young intern, as I was in Parliament over 20 years ago. I was and have remained struck by Stephen's integrity and his approach. I'm profoundly grateful for all that I learned from him about the subject that we'll be looking at this evening. So there are panelists, ladies and gentlemen. Jenny, Steve and Stephen, thank you so much for being with us this evening. Let me just explain how the evening is going to work, the flow of our discussion. We'll have two sections with the panel where I'll be asking questions. Then we'll return for a third section, which will allow me to put to the panel some of the questions that we'll be inviting you to submit in on Zoom. And we'll also have a couple of opportunities, in fact, to vote this evening. So we'll have a little Zoom poll to be able to get a sense of people's experiences in this area of disagreement. So that is the plan for the evening. We hope you enjoy it and that it is helpful for you. Jenny, let's kick off with you. Thank you so much for being with us this evening. Tell us about your fight. What things cause disagreement in your context, in your environment, that of a school? Where has it got quite nasty and why? Jenny, tell us about that, please.
Hi, evening everybody. It's really nice to be here. Yes, I think in terms of disagreements, I probably have disagreements with people every single day, multiple times a day. I think the first thing is really I work with all sorts of different types of people. And I've always worked in secondary schools, so I think working with teenagers, you can probably imagine that there are lots of disagreements with them. They're at the time of their lives when they are questioning lots of things and like to push boundaries. But in all honesty, they, for me, are the easy ones to deal with. That's part of kind of my job, that's what I expect. And some of the hardest disagreements and some of the nastiest disagreements have actually been with other stakeholders that I work with. So for example, I work with parents, staff, governors. I've always worked with kind of beyond the school, so with local authorities or as part of multi-academy trusts. So there's a whole wide variety of people out there, and I think education is also quite a hot topic in the media. There are lots of people that feel that they really know and understand the context that we work in, that might perhaps think a little bit differently to how I do or we do in education. So there's lots of opportunities there for conflict. I think some of the really difficult ones really probably have been with parents and with staff. And it tends to be when there are situations, either decisions that I have made myself or somebody has made that I am fronting, and somebody just doesn't like it for whatever reason. And I think, you know, for parents, their children are very precious to them. And so something that might impact on their children or their child can cause a lot of grief and a lot of upset. And also for staff, it is their job, it's their livelihood. And so if they are unhappy with a decision I've made, if it impacts on them in a very negative way from their perspective, then that can get very nasty. And I've had all sorts of types of disagreements and in all sorts of different places. I think probably my least favourite is out in the pavement, being shouted and screamed at and sworn at by parents in front of students. So I think that's my least favourite, but actually sometimes it's quite easy to deal with because it's so extreme. And I think sometimes the extreme ones you can sort of have a more obvious solution to. Some of the other nasty ones are when it feels very personal for me. As Paul said, my background as a head, this is my second headship, and both schools have been developing free schools. So that's lots of decisions that I've made, and starting a school from scratch, you are incredibly invested in that process. It means a huge amount to me. It means a huge amount to the community. And so if people are disagreeing with the things that I might have decided, that can feel very personal and can be really hard to take, actually. And I think sometimes they're the really upsetting ones if you let it get personal, or if you take it in a really personal way. So I think that gives a bit of context. Is that enough information at this point, Paul?
That's brilliant. I stand in admiration, Jenny, of the challenges that you must face in that situation. And you've talked a little bit there about the need for resilience, which we'll come back to in a little while. Thank you for that insight. Steve, your situation's different. I mean, you're in a situation where you're a church leader. There may be some similarities, but tell us about your particular context. What's your fight? What are areas of disagreement in the context of leading a church?
Yeah, so there's certainly potential for disagreement in a church, and anyone who is part of a church will know that. And so, yeah, that kind of seeking to bring understanding and around a whole lot of things, whether it's doctrinal or whether it's practical. It's part of life for me. But I wanted tonight to maybe just reflect on one area, which is that, as you mentioned in your introduction, Paul, for the last 10, probably 12 years now, I've found myself quite involved in helping a conversation about sexuality and faith, specifically what discipleship might mean for someone who is same-sex attracted. And that's been it within my church setting, but also been helping other churches also to have that conversation. And I guess my kind of heart there has been to for us to have the best conversation we can possibly have. You reflected, Paul, on the fact that there's a lot of poor conversation around us, where kind of arguments become weapons to take our opponents out. And digital media is particularly prone to kind of slanging, dismissing others, or putting them in a box of ignorance or shame if they don't disagree, if they don't agree with me. And what my heart in this has been very much to try to encourage a really high quality conversation that befits the people of God. So that's what I've been up to, but difficult. Yeah, and just to indicate something of the difficulty there, I mean, once that kind of conversation is going on within the life of a church, then people do feel quite threatened, quite defensive, and even can become hostile. I can remember a guy who disappeared from the church for a little while, and when I finally caught up with him on the phone, he said to me that he'd been offended because a young girl in a testimony one Sunday evening had spoken of a friend of hers who was gay and a Christian. And I remember the incident, and this guy said, you know, those two words can't sit in the same sentence, Steve. Now, I begged to differ with him, but pleaded with him, will you stay in the conversation, stay in the church? But he wouldn't, and so we never saw him again. I can remember lots of conversations in the pub, which felt more productive, with members who were trying to get their head round, well, actually, is there more than one way to look at the scriptures on this? And but sometimes those discussions could be more heat than light, and that was difficult. I think perhaps that one of the hardest aspects of this for me personally was when I found myself at odds with a fellow church leader, someone in my team, who had a very different idea about how the church might pursue this area of life, and it was difficult. We kind of fell out. There was a lot of anger, a lot of heat, but actually pursuing that with one another did lead to a much better kind of place. But I'd indicate at this stage that was quite difficult. I think the other things I just quickly throw in would be that to try to enable a conversation of this kind will meet all kinds of responses. There are some church communities who will just want to avoid this and are somewhat forced to look at it when somebody comes out in the church or a same-sex couple appear one Sunday morning. But there's also, interestingly, the kind of attitudes of, well, look, there's nothing to talk about. What do you mean, a conversation about sexuality? The Bible's clear, and we need to understand what the Bible's saying and do it. But then that same kind of reaction can come from the other end of the spectrum, where someone will say, well, actually, this is really a matter of justice and of love. Either we're going to love and accept people as Jesus did, or we're not. Either we're affirming or we're non-affirming. And so what interests me there is you can get those very binary possibilities from a very evangelical position, a very conservative position, as much as at the affirming end, saying it's either this or it's this. And I think one of the struggles for me is trying to help a conversation where we can really talk to each other, really listen to one another and engage well together, find an understanding that we can build a good pastoral missional response from.
Steve, thank you so much. So helpful and interesting. And you don't avoid the thorny issues, do you? You've gone straight for a big one, and really helpful to hear your introduction to that. So we will look forward to exploring that more. Stephen, then a third, very different context again. We've had a school, church, and now Parliament. Talk to us a little bit about that, please. What things cause disagreement within that environment? Is it different from what we've heard from Jenny and Steve?
Well, thank you, Paul. Thanks for inviting me along. Let me just say a little bit first about how I became the MP, because there were some conflicts on the way. I'm not from a Christian family, became a Christian as a teenager. I first visited Newham, where I'm now one of the MPs, when I was a student, and our Christian Union came to help out with a church mission here. It was only a fortnight, but we had a great time. And afterwards, I think for the first time, I had a sense of how what I believed should shape my life. Then a couple of years later, I left university, got a job in London. I rented a room in the house of one of the mission team. I joined the church, which the team had by then planted. I'm still a member of that. And also pursuing a long-standing interest, which I'd never previously done anything about, I joined the Labour Party. Now, at the time, there was a great deal of conflict in our local Labour Party. It was split down the middle. Some things don't change that much, but I remember being quite worried that a keen churchgoer like me might not be very welcome in such a very politicized organization, and also in a community that at the end of the 1970s was multiracial and multi-faith. But actually, I found the opposite was true, that I was kind of trusted to take on party responsibilities, and also people of other faiths were more comfortable dealing with another person of faith, even if it was a different faith to theirs. I became a local councillor, leader of the council, and eventually the MP. And I think a lot of Christians worry about getting involved in politics because they think what will happen will be that a few weeks after joining the party, there'll be a situation blow up where the party whips say one thing, faith says the opposite, and it all collapses in a heap. And I held elected office of the Labour Party representative for 37 years now, and that kind of crisis has never happened to me. I think it's a real shame that worrying about it puts so many off. But the closest I ever came was over David Cameron's same-sex marriage bill. I've always supported legal equality for same-sex relationships, but I didn't think they were the same as marriages. Ed Miliband, our party leader at the time, wanted to apply a 3-line whip to vote in favour of David Cameron's bill, and I just decided I couldn't vote for it. I was a shadow minister at the time. Defying a 3-line whip automatically means resigning. So I went to see Ed. I explained my position. He listened very courteously. I think others spoke to him too, and he decided in the end to make it a 1-line whip instead. So I voted against the third reading of the bill and stayed in my job. But I was on the receiving end of a furious blast from one of the councillors in my constituency. He was absolutely livid that I hadn't voted for the bill. And there have been very few occasions when something I've done has had such an angry response. He was somebody I worked quite closely with. It was upsetting to have provoked that reaction. But we did continue to work together, if you have to. And then in 2019, there was an effort to replace me as the local Labour parliamentary candidate. And I was really grateful that councillor stated publicly that he was supporting me in the reselection. It might say more about the merits of the alternative candidate and perhaps about mine. But, I kind of felt that was something that one way or another we had managed to work through.
Stephen, thank you so much. That's such an insight into your life and the world of Parliament. And sometimes my own kind of far more limited experience of Parliament was sometimes in a weird way, in very political circles, they can be sometimes less political than a school and a church, weirdly. Perhaps part of that is everyone expects Parliament to be political, but perhaps not those other environments.
I think there's a very clear framework for it in Parliament. I think, and everybody expects there to be disagreements, and the system kind of enables it.
Yeah, I suppose that's true. There's that's in place, and that's a given and understood thing. One of the we've entitled this event tonight "Fight Like a Christian," and as each of you were talking, I was just reflecting on the fact that sometimes perhaps the criticism that is handled often perhaps least well and can be most stinging personally can come from others who also are Christians. It strikes me that often Christians don't necessarily deal with disagreement or conflict in a very Christ-like way. So talk to me a little bit about that. Perhaps, Jenny, first of all, have you had experience within the context of a school where it's come from those who are also Christians? Has that been something you've had to deal with? Other examples that you can think of? Has that been particularly tricky?
A little bit. I wouldn't say it's the trickiest part of it for me, because actually I think I don't work with many Christians. So I've only ever worked with a few Christians in each school. So I think the difficulty of me, I understand what Stephen's saying about that worry about being a Christian in the workplace. And I think that's been more of an issue for me, really, is feeling exposed in that sense. And I think in general society, well, in education, perhaps, I don't know, I've always been in education, so I'm a little bit institutionalized in that sense. But I think there's often been a lot of scathing remarks about it. So I have definitely come across that. I think what I do find difficult is if I've had members of staff who are Christians and have very obviously behaved in a difficult way. And that I find very awkward to deal with, because I see that public nature of how they're behaving, and people are looking at me to see how I would deal with that, and kind of cringing almost and thinking, why have you done that? You're a Christian. so that is really, really hard. But I don't think that I expect them to necessarily behave better towards me in terms of disagreements, because I think I've very much come to realise that people are people and will automatically revert to that sort of human nature of just reacting emotionally to difficult situations. And I think that's what I'm very much tuned into now. And so I don't actually get any more upset that it's a Christian, because I think it's still, disagreements are still hard, and people still go about things in interesting ways, what I would perceive sometimes to be the wrong way, but that's a whole disagreement in itself, isn't it? And I think for me the important thing is about how I model that behaviour to others. I mean, the school that I'm in now is a Church of England school. I've never worked in a Church of England school before, and so that is quite interesting, because you do get people that sort of throw that at you about, and call yourself a Christian and you're doing this. So I think there's that sort of exposure, you're not being nice to me, and you're meant to be a Christian. So that's quite hard.
Yeah, interesting, thank you. And Stephen, within the political realm, do you get letters or emails or tweets from Christians? Have there been occasions where you found those particularly painful or difficult?
I've certainly had some very critical letters and emails from people kind of writing to me as a Christian and saying, how can you be doing such and such when you're a Christian? I mean, as you can imagine, I do get quite a lot of critical correspondence of various kinds. So I wouldn't say that I've found it particularly difficult when it comes from Christians. I think on the whole, in our church, for example, a very small church, we haven't had big disagreements about anything. And I think if we had, and I can very much empathise with what Steve was saying earlier, I think if we had, that could have been really difficult. I've kind of depended on being able to go to church, to meet with others at church, and not to have a row there. Whereas, everything else I was doing, I was rowing the whole time. But I can certainly imagine it could have been different. There were things that came up where we could have had a big row. I'm thankful that we didn't. I'm sure if we had, it would have been very difficult in exactly the way that Steve was describing.
Interesting, and thank you, Stephen. And Steve, in a way, your context is the opposite. The question I was going to ask you was the extent to which sometimes you've had to deal with criticism from those outside of the context of the church or Christian leadership, and how you felt about that, how you've responded to that. Have there been examples of that?
Yeah, I think I was just listening to Jenny and Stephen there. What struck me was how sometimes we can be criticised because one person's idea of what a what it means to be a Christian and what it means to work out Christian life and beliefs is very set and particular. And I think that I can relate to that. There are times when expectations of people within the congregation, particularly, are, and they all move in different directions, different expectations. And at some point, you've got to get to a point of saying that actually I'm responsible for working out my faith and following Christ, just as each person is within the community. And something about just giving people room to do that. But sorry, your question was about responding to criticism from outside of the church community. I have to say that I haven't experienced a lot of that. When I have been talking to folk in the community, someone's cutting my hair or whatever it might be, and they ask me, well, we might get talking about the sexuality issue, because I like to know what people are thinking outside of the church. And there's all kinds of reactions, some of which is, well, really, is there anything to talk about? Hasn't this been sorted out, but often there is also an appreciation for the fact that the church is engaging with this as an issue rather than just kind of burying its head in the sand. But I honestly can't think of a time where I was criticized by an outside group. Maybe I just haven't lived dangerously enough. I don't
know. Well, it sounds as if you do. You live very dangerously. That's great. Well, it's so interesting, isn't it? There are three very different spheres, but all where disagreement, where conflict exists. I guess it reinforces to us that disagreement is part and parcel of life, and we have to handle that, and we want to do that as resilient, authentic disciples, which is often a challenge for us. This is great. Well, we have an opportunity, ladies and gentlemen, for everyone to vote on something. So what is the question that we're going to vote on? Well, let me read it to you. This is the question: how often do you experience disagreement on your front line? So whatever that front line is, we've got three very different ones we've heard from, but this is an opportunity to vote. So if you can vote as quickly as you can. Is that multiple times a week you experience disagreement on your front line, or weekly? Is it monthly, rarely, or never? If you would like to vote now, that would be great. And then we'll see what the result is of this unscientific, wholly unrepresentative panel this evening, but it'll just give us a little indication of what is going on. So, first place weekly at 28%, but closely followed by 27% for multiple times a week, monthly and rarely draw at 23%. It's pretty even, actually, isn't it? So interesting. What is interesting is that no one never experiences disagreement. So that is something that all of us have in common, which possibly is partly why we're here this evening. That is great. Well, goodness me, how interesting. Let's just shift the conversation now. We've talked about the nature of the fight, of the disagreement, where it has gone wrong. But in your distinctive context, how have you dealt with that disagreement? How have you attempted to deal with it as a follower of Jesus? Steve, perhaps come to you first on this one. Talk to us, please, about that.
Okay, yeah, I mentioned that I've done quite a lot of work with other churches, kind of trying to engage, help a conversation with lots of good resources and so on. Typically what happened at the end of each of those kind of one-day seminars would be that there'll be recognition that actually there's a wide range of viewpoints and convictions in the room, and how those might be held together helpfully was hard to think about. Partly because of that, we did a bit of a deep dive at Bookham Baptist Church, and part of a master's degree that I was doing, some research. I got 12 people together, including myself, recruited them with a range of viewpoints on issues of sexuality and faith, and we talked for 6 months, not non-stop. We did have breaks for meals and things, but over 6 months we engaged with this with a view to coming to the church meeting. And I would just say that actually that deep dive, as I called it, commissioned by the church, was was a real gift to our context, and that group came united to the church meeting to say, we're never going to resolve the different perspectives that we have. That's just not going to happen anytime soon. But we've caught a vision of a church keeping some kind of creative tension, holding our views well in a way that gives space for people to find Christ and to follow him within a loving community that gives people room to grow along the, as they seek to respond to Christ and to the Holy Spirit. And so we kind of set that out as a bit of a challenge and invited the church to journey on with that. And I would say that we still are journeying with that, most recently with same-sex couple as part of our church, which actually changes the whole journey, because now we're not talking about people, we're together and we're working things through. So I guess it was kind of committing to that journey and seeing where it might take us, and the idea that this isn't about winning an argument one way or another. It's about being able to hold different views together in a really helpful kind of missional, pastoral way. And that's what we've been kind of working on, and what I'm continuing to try to encourage within different contexts.
Thank you, Steve. Jenny, in your context, can you think of some ways that you've dealt with disagreement, some examples, strategies perhaps that you've deployed?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I've got examples of and strategies of doing it really badly and strategies of doing it well. I think for me and my personality, I am kind of split between finding discord quite difficult. I like to work in a harmonious environment. And so the danger of that side of things is not resolving disagreements, but just giving somebody what they want in order to have a settled environment. But equally, I feel very, very passionate and very strongly about doing things the right way and a godly way. So when there are things that aren't like that, then I have a strong voice in those situations as well. So even within myself, there is a sort of disagreement between those two sides. And both of those have sort of come out in the wrong way in the past, I think. So I've sort of settled really on a way that I handle disagreements. I've had to work incredibly hard at this, and I've had a lot of experience because I'm just exposed to it so much. And I think partly that's been God shaping me and putting me in those situations that I've really had to work at and really shape, with his help. So for me, the sort of key verse in the Bible really that helps me the most with this is out from James 1, 19 to 20, where it talks about being quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. And it's easy to say those words. It's not always as easy to actually do them. So in terms of strategies, I think that quick to listen and slow to speak have been things that I've really worked hard at. I often will get incredibly angry people screaming down the phone at me. I've had the one that springs to mind the most is somebody who was had a very difficult situation with their child, was very, very angry with me and with life in general actually, and was just horrendously abusive down the phone. So it's an extreme example, and it would have been very easy for me just to say, no, I'm not tolerating that, because I don't think you should have to tolerate it. And if it was another member of staff, I wouldn't let them be put in that position. But what I actually did is thought, this person really needs some help, because there's something wrong here, and I am not having anybody talk to me like that either. So what I actually did is invited them in and listened. So I didn't speak really in that conversation. I just let them absolutely rant, and I didn't respond and I didn't speak. And then I invited them in and just said to them, that isn't how we behave. That is not how I work. I won't have people talk to me like that, but I have a real sense that there's something going on and we need to work together. So we're going to sit down now and we're going to sort this out together. You are going to tell me, you know, how you're feeling, everything that's going on, and I'm going to listen to you. And I just sat and listened. And there's a very long story behind that, because it took a while, but we actually came to the point where we then had an incredibly good relationship, to the point where she invited me out for a drink. This is a parent invited me out for a drink down the pub when she said, when my child leaves school, we're going out for a drink. And we actually became, you know, I wouldn't go so far as to say friends, but in that context, you know, we got on incredibly well. And it was because I'd actually given her time and I'd listened and I made promises to her. So, you know, I said, I can't promise you that everything's going to be perfect, because it won't be, and we will meet difficulties along the way, but I will promise you this is how I will work with you. So we were able to set a structure, a bit like you're saying, Steve. We were able to set a context in which we knew how to behave when we disagreed and how to work it out. And I think that was a valuable lesson for me, and for her. She'd been very, very hurt by the education system and was really, really scarred and wounded. And so I felt very privileged actually to be part of that process of restoring that faith in a system. And I think it is, again, it's a bit like it says in the Psalms about being compassionate. You know, there's that other verse about being compassionate and gracious and slow to anger and abounding in love, and really trying to model that to people and model that to others. I think I deal a lot with developing leaders as well, and one of the other bits of advice that I say to them is that whenever you get, particularly on email, because people love to just be keyboard warriors, and or on any sort of social media, and we do really, like you were saying, Stephen, we get it in the neck from all sorts in that sense, and it's when it really hits that nerve and it makes it personal and it's really, really upsetting, and you just have this instant emotional reaction and you just get back on your keyboard and start to hit back. And so my big bit of advice is really, okay, type out your email, say what you want to say, but do not send it. Give yourself 24 hours, and that that slow to become angry is really hard. So I sort of say, well, you start off by, you'll be quick to be angry, but slow that process down by not actually responding. So don't respond, give yourself some thinking time, reread it, really think to yourself. I question myself all the time. So whenever I'm in a disagreement, I've stopped just feeding my own sense of self-righteousness. I used to do that loads. I used to think, of course I'm right, I know I'm right about this, how on earth can they possibly think like that? And actually I've really tried to stop doing that and to think, okay, right, I know I don't agree with what they're saying, but let me just stop and think, why are they thinking like this? Why are they saying that? It's not always actually the issue that they're coming out with. There's often deeper things underneath that you sort of need to tap into. But buying yourself that thinking time, I think, has really helped to sort of train and develop me into following, that advice in that passage from James.
So interesting, so good. Thank you, Jenny. And it's so good to have something restorative, redemptive in that example that you gave. And Stephen, when you were talking earlier, you talked about going to Ed Miliband and having that conversation with him, and that was obviously one example of a disagreement and the way that you dealt with it, which also had a redemptive, positive outcome. Can you think of other examples where you've had to deal with disagreement and how you've done that?
Well, I was trying to think of some examples where I've sat down to work out a position kind of theologically before acting, and I really can't think of many of those. But I do think, though, that what I believe, in particular, probably the fellowship and support I've enjoyed at church, the message I hear there week after week, have always been at the heart of what I do and the way I do it, for better or worse. So when I was elected councillor, first of all, there was a small group in my church that offered to meet monthly to pray for what I was doing. Then when I became council leader, they decided they'd better do it weekly. And we still do that pretty much every Sunday before church. And that gives a chance to think through what I'm doing, including conflicts that are going on with like-minded Christians. And for me, that really has made a world of difference. I think sometimes about what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 12 about the church, that God has placed the parts in the body, every one of them just as he wanted them to be. There's a model there for the church, which is an attractive model for society as well. This recognition that we all belong together, that we all need each other, that we depend on each other. And I think that's a good antidote to the corrosive kind of self-centeredness, which is pervasive in politics and helps explain why confidence in politics is at a pretty low ebb. Tom Wright, in one of his books, makes the point that, I'm quoting what he wrote, people who believe in the resurrection, in God making a whole new world in which everything will be set right at last, are unstoppably motivated to work for that new world in the present. And, you know, I think we've seen quite a lot of that happening in the pandemic. And what's impressed me about the last year is the way that other people outside the churches have seen that happening as well and been really impressed by it. And in I think quite a new way. And you mentioned at the start, I chair the all-party parliamentary group on faith and society. We published a report based on research last summer about this, and just setting out just how dependent on local churches and to some extent as well other faith groups, councils and communities have been in the pandemic. And you know, I think that's been a really interesting example of churches having an impact on their communities and kind of winning new support for what they're doing in a way that we haven't seen, well, I think for a very, very long time.
So interesting. Thank you, Stephen. And I suppose all of you have, I mean, Jenny, you commented on a kind of, if you like, self-recognition that, you know, sometimes you're aware you haven't handled conflict particularly well as those opportunities where you've done it better. But all of you in your different contexts will have witnessed conflict being handled unbelievably badly. In fact, you that might be the source of conflict for you. Any of you want to talk about that a little bit, where you've observed that? Is that something, Steve, I'm thinking in the context of the local church, you've almost had to step in perhaps as the arbiter, the peacemaker? Yeah,
interesting. I mean, this is unrelated to the area that I've been referring to. The COVID months have been a bit of a pressure cooker in some ways in terms of some of the things going on for people. And I would say that it's been a really bumpy time for the team that I lead, actually. And there's been some fallouts, actually. And I was actually, I was finding one particular team member difficult. As you say, I'm usually in a place of helping other people to find peace, but suddenly I found myself really it was quite a visible thing for everybody else that we were at odds, and it needed, we couldn't sort it out on our own, and actually we asked somebody to come and sit with us and help us to talk and get to the bottom of this. And a guy in the church who does this for his living, his calling is about peacemaking and mediating, came, and we had 3 conversations over 3 weeks, and it did the job. But it just, I tell you, it really humbled me, if I'm honest, because I see myself as the peacemaker, and suddenly I was unable to overcome a conflict with a colleague, and that just kind of really loomed up during the whole kind of COVID thing. So yeah, that was tricky.
Brilliant, thanks, Steve. We've talked about the nature of your fight, the nature of the disagreement. We've talked about how you dealt with that and the challenges and opportunities associated with that. But here's the thing, we all need help, don't we? We need help to be able to disagree well, disagree agreeably, I guess. Are there any particular resources that you have found especially helpful as you've tried to navigate disagreement and conflict? What have you found helpful in enabling you to be an agent of reconciliation? Stephen, why don't we start off with you on this one? Any resources, tips you could give us?
Yeah, a few thoughts here. I mean, I think I want to make the point that I do think there are attributes that Christians have that fit them for this kind of peacemaker role. And I think we should be kind of quite confident about what we can offer in these situations. I have certainly found it very helpful to have that kind of prayer group that meets once a week to talk and pray together. And that for me has been a really helpful way to kind of think through and then deal with problems that I've been reflecting on. I also do preach from time to time, not very often, but from time to time, and I often find myself a bit frustrated that I've got to take a few hours out to prepare. But having done it, I always find it enormously helpful to have done it, to think things through afresh in light of what the Bible says. I quoted earlier something that Tom Wright wrote, and I find his books and his commentaries enormously helpful. So preaching does force me to kind of read and think properly, and I do find that resources me in what I'm trying to do. I'm not sure it does much for the people I'm preaching to, but it certainly does help me.
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. I'm sure a lot of us can bear witness to that ourselves. Often sometimes I find I hear a sermon that's very challenging, and I find out, I was the person speaking, and maybe no one else was challenged by it, but certainly the process of preparation formed me and has impacted me in some way.
Yeah.
Jenny, what about you? Any resources you would point us to that you found helpful, maybe, or a course perhaps you've done that was useful in this regard?
Now, this is going to sound really cheesy, Paul, but the course that I'm going to talk about is the Executive Toolbox.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jenny. Thank you.
And I promise everybody we did not set that up. But genuinely, that helped me massively. And that came at a real time that was desperately needed in my life, actually. And I absolutely loved it. So I think, like Stephen said, it's something that gives you that time for reflection. So I don't necessarily have a particular book that I would say, oh yeah, this is brilliant, read this, it really helps with conflict. I personally don't tend to work like that so much, really, but I think the time with the Exec Toolbox and working through those issues and really forcing me to think about the way that I behave and having that, where that comes from in the Bible. And again, it might sound a little bit cliche, but I think my best resource is the Bible. God, looking at God's word, looking at the life of Jesus, looking at how they, how that should shape our lives and the way that we behave, I think is incredibly important. And similarly, like Stephen said, prayer for me as well, it's about my own prayer, and it's about giving everything to God. So it's that focus on sharing my burdens. Again, it's these sort of verses that we really know and you could just trip off the tongue. It's actually doing it. And I think that's what I realised that I hadn't been doing for years. I knew it all. I could talk about, casting your burdens, but I didn't actually do it. I still kept things to myself because I wanted to. I'm, a self-confessed control freak. I like being in control. I like making decisions, and so I kind of almost wanted that a little bit, and I wanted to work through those problems, but that's not how we're called to live as Christians, and it wasn't very healthy either. It's incredibly stressful. So I think giving it all to God when I'm in the middle of disagreements, or if I'm going into a meeting that I know is going to be really difficult, or I suddenly am faced with something immediately, you know, genuinely in the street or something like that, then I will pray about it a lot, and that makes a huge difference. I think my other sort of tip really is about what I've done in terms of preventing disagreement, because I do think we haven't really touched on that, and I think there's a lot of work that you can do to prevent disagreement in the first place. And so I've done a lot of work on the reasons why people do things, and the reasons behind my decisions. So if it's a decision that I'm going to make that's going to potentially cause conflict or disagreements, I spend a lot of time talking to people about the why. And I think that is really, really important as well, to sort of preempt things and think through that.
Thank you, Jenny. Thank you. Colin Lowe, who's with us this evening, he has a message to say, I was on the same executive toolbox cohort as Jenny, and you were, the screen's just rolled down, but the message is she is a real joy, a great model of Christian leadership, and extremely wise. So there's some encouragement for you this evening, Jenny. Steve Elms, anything you would recommend to us as helpful resources that can equip us in this area?
Yeah, so I'm going to have to say the Bible, aren't I? And the rhythms of worship and prayer. And for me, there's something about the vision that the Bible holds of a light of everything brought to oneness. That in Ephesians 1, the all things brought together in Christ. And I think that one of the things for a church community is to really get hold of that vision and let that impact us. And that happened to me in a very particular way. I was going for a walk in a forest near where I live, and I'd spent the morning getting my case together, my arguments together for a situation, and I was feeling quite strongly about kind of really wanting to win, and so I'm just confessing all my sins tonight, which is also good for the soul. But I remember that as I was walking, I had this sudden mental image of myself weaponed up, you know, all kinds of artillery at my side. And these were my arguments, my you know, I was gonna kind of win the day with this one, push that big red button, and boom. And that's a terrible thing to confess. But as I was having that image, the prophet Isaiah turning our weapons into harvest tools, the swords into plowshares, it went right to my heart. It was God said, now you're weaponed up. How about turning those into harvest tools? How about agriculture? You know, and so actually something there about how we turn our arguments and our good points and our well prepared cases into something that brings harvest. I wanted just to mention two other quick things. One is the Baptist tradition holds something for those of us who I'm a Baptist pastor, but and that is that one of the principles of the movement of the Baptist tradition is a declaration of principle, number one, which says, and I'm really summing it up, it's not the detail, Jesus is Lord and is revealed to us through the Holy Scriptures. And every church has the freedom to work out what it means to follow in his way. And I'm so grateful for that bit of kind of church tradition, which is there at the heart of Baptist life, which allows for us to know what's non-negotiable, that actually Jesus is Lord is our rallying cry, but also that freedom to work stuff out together and to do that well. And another quick specific thing I might mention is some of the work of Pete Scazzero on emotionally healthy spirituality and emotionally healthy relationships. And what Pete has done amazingly well is bring together the contemplative tradition with some really good kind of insight from the modern sciences. And I think that's something that we're traveling with, because it's about if we can get better at listening to one another and engaging at a deeper level, below the surface of what we might argue about, a bit like what you did, Jenny, with your irate kind of parent, that you actually kind of got behind what was presenting and what's this really about. And I think we need to be doing some of that. The only other thing I'd like to mention, if I may, is just that you asked about kind of resources, and in terms of the area of disagreement, of conversation that I'm getting into, I found myself developing some resources, because quite a lot of the books and stuff that are out there are about proving this or proving that. And so I've kind of developed some resources, written some books, and I guess I feel that's something that I've been able to contribute and to bring, to kind of develop some resources where there's a bit of a gap in terms of if a church wants to make a journey, then yeah, how might they go about that?
Interesting, so good. Thank you, Steve. I've been struck as the three of you have been talking, I suppose, three thoughts. One, I think, Stephen, when you were talking, I was just struck and reflecting again on the fruit of the Spirit, on the fact that as disciples of Jesus, as people enlivened with the life of the Spirit, the idea is that we are fruitful, and that fruitfulness in Galatians is described as love and joy and peace and patience and kindness and goodness and faithfulness and gentleness, self-control. They're all amazing qualities for conflict, aren't they? And disagreement. I sort of think, gosh, if I could be authentically modeling those things, that would be so helpful for handling disagreement, and those things that are contested. I suppose the second reflection I had as you were speaking, Steve Elms, is we probably all have this experience where we might have been right, but actually we've been wrong because we've wanted to win too much, and in a sense that's become the focus. And I guess we like to be winners, don't we? We want to be proved right. We want to be vindicated sometimes in these situations. And then I suppose the third thought I had was that it's interesting, isn't it, as we read the Gospels and reflect on the life of Jesus, we see someone who deals with all this brilliantly, but who doesn't avoid conflict. And I guess as I was again reflecting on some of the things that you were saying, it struck me that sometimes I think perhaps our tendency is that we respond to conflict by trying to avoid it and disengage. And that's not always very healthy or appropriate. Conflict avoidance can actually be quite unhealthy.
Yes.
I don't know if any reflections on any of that from you. I've got a question after that, so I'll just ask the question then, shall I? So this is Phil Clark. So we're coming to questions proper in a minute, but I just thought it was really good opportunity to ask this. He's sent in a question, and he said quite rightly that we've used the time really so far to talk about how we diffuse disagreement and conflict, but surely there are times when God expects us as Christians to name evil, to if you like stand in conflict against perhaps a gross injustice in society, to confront it. How do we take up that fight in a Christian way? Stephen Timms, I can't help it. I'm coming to you on this one. Have you got any thoughts on that?
Well, I suppose all of us in Parliament think that we are seeking to do that, and that the parliamentary system kind of gives you a space to stand up and say what you think is right, and also what you think is wrong, and to make that case forcefully and strongly, and certainly in instances when we believe that what we are criticizing is injustice, that we'd identify what the Bible says as a reason for highlighting that, then that's a very strong kind of ground to stand on, and conveys a lot of confidence, I think. And I agree, that is something we are certainly called to do. But equally, I do think it's important to underline, as we have done in this discussion, that Christians have got a lot to give in sort of the fights that are going on around us. And I think that's been particularly clear in the pandemic, that there are lots of things that churches have done that actually no one else has been able to do in communities right across the country. Steve made the point about the pressure within the church during the pandemic, and I'm sure that's been experienced very widely. But actually, the churches have contributed some extraordinary things in this year, and I really hope that society as a whole kind of learns the lessons from that, and that there'll be new opportunities in the future for churches as a result.
Thank you, Stephen. We've got some great questions that are coming in, so I'm really looking forward to putting these to the panel, but why don't we have another vote? Okay, so we've got a different question now, and this is to do with where you've seen conflict modeled well. So the question that we'd like you to vote on is, where have you seen conflict handled best? Is it A, church, or is it work? Is it family, amongst family, with friends, or in another context? So where have you seen conflict handled best? Please vote now. So isn't that fascinating? So we've seen conflict handled best in a work situation. So interesting. I wonder whether that relates a little bit to what you were saying, Stephen Timms, earlier about, obviously within a parliamentary context, the sort of rules of engagement are clear. Maybe sometimes they're relatively clear in a work context, but in those other environments, less so. So we just sort of have to muddy our way through. But so interesting. So we've seen conflict handled best in a work context. How interesting. Any comments, panel, on that finding? Does that surprise you or not before we come to the questions?
That doesn't surprise me at all, actually, because I think you have to resolve disagreements at work, because I think the consequences, depends what it is, but you know, it can result in people losing jobs, etc. Whereas you know, I think in my role, I deal with an awful lot of disagreements within families. We often get called in to sort of help resolve those, or I see the issues that happen in families, and I think there's, you know, in lots of families, no reason why those disagreements can't just roll on for years. And I think we can probably all think of examples where there's very bitter and difficult fallings out in families, because there isn't that same sort of, same consequence in terms of, well, there is a massive consequence, but not in terms of their livelihood, etc. So yeah, it doesn't surprise me, actually.
Yeah, no, it's so interesting, isn't it? It's well, there we are. I was interested as well. I think it was when you were talking, Jenny, about the use of email, that I remember years ago, Microsoft circulated an email, ironically, to all of its staff, encouraging their staff to email less. And their thought was that it often doesn't bring the best out of people. It's not always the most effective communication tool, particularly in relation to conflict. So that was interesting. I mean, if even Microsoft are encouraging people to email less, that's interesting, isn't it, at least? Yeah. Let's come then to these great questions we've had from everyone this evening. Here's a question about something you've referred to a couple of times, Stephen Timms, but is around the pandemic and lockdown. So I'll bring Steve Elms, this question to you. First of all, do the panelists think this is harder during these times of lockdown, where we're in a more virtual world, where we're meeting people as we are this evening online, rather than kind of face-to-face in person? Is it more difficult to listen well in that situation? Is conflict harder, would you say, in lockdown and over Zoom, Steve?
Yeah, I would say undoubtedly that some of the tensions that have been around within our church have been in part because you don't have the kind of the close-up body language and the cues that are there when you're face-to-face in a physical way. Zoom is an amazing gift, isn't it, in as much as it's making possible all kinds of connections, but there's a poverty there too, that there are things that are missing that I think do make it difficult. And so I think if there is an atmosphere. I mean, have you experienced as an atmosphere over Zoom? You know, when there's, it's a weird thing to think about, but actually I think it can be difficult to negotiate with that, to work out what's happening and how to help one another because of that kind of disconnection that we're experiencing. So I would say yes, definitely it's a factor.
Interesting. Stephen, Tim's, there are quite a few questions that relate to politics and sort of the political context. There's one here that's talking about what are the chances of US politics becoming less polarized over the next 4 years. You might have something to say on that, but also I suppose I'd be conscious that our own political environment in the UK is pretty polarized. There are a number of polarized things going on at the moment. I was watching some of Nicola Sturgeon's evidence yesterday. So there are questions around the integrity of the union. People take very different positions on that. Obviously, we had the Brexit debate and referendum that was, fairly polarized. Both as you reflect on the States, but also in the UK, are you optimistic about the future or not?
I do feel fairly optimistic about the future of the US. I mean, I think I hope things will become less polarized. I mean, how confident one can be they will become less polarized, I'm not sure. I mean, clearly Joe Biden wants them to be, but there are massive chasms in the US, and there are, as you say, there are some pretty significant chasms here as well. I took part in a radio interview this morning and was sort of deluged afterwards by really angry comments on Twitter in response to what I'd said, and it just reminded me just how deeply people are disagreeing. I hope things are going to improve here and in the States. I think they could, but can't be too sure. I think actually I do think the churches again have got a really important role here. The way that churches have helped communities in this pandemic, I think it opens up new opportunities across the whole community for people to relate in a way that they wouldn't normally do. And it's not. I would never have predicted that the pandemic would have had that effect, but I think it has. I think communities are seeing churches in a different and a really significantly more positive way. And one of the things that's happened is opening up to a more positive set of relationships across the community as a whole, thanks to what the churches have done.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Exactly. I've been aware that during this pandemic, I've almost become more local and more global at exactly the same time. So, I've had conversations with people that I probably wouldn't have had who are the other side of the world, just because Zoom has become, and there are obviously alternative providers available, but so much part and parcel of day-to-day work. At the same time, very conscious of our immediate local space, our immediate neighborhood, the clapping for the NHS, for example, or we now have a WhatsApp of our neighbors in the nearest locality that we didn't have before. So it's so interesting, isn't it, that how that has worked. Debbie Clark this evening recommends a little book called Getting to Yes from Harvard Business School. It helps negotiate for any situation. So thank you for that recommendation, Debbie. Let me ask you panelists about something that may in part relate to your areas, but is also probably more general as well. And that is, it's a question that's come from Rob and Margit, who ask, how do you, if at all, address fellow Christians who are exposed to a totally different set of facts and where there is a complete polarization of understanding in society and politics? I suppose, perhaps seen some of this a little bit in terms of around vaccinations, that, there will be people that, are exposed to a certain set of facts that lead them to a position of opposing vaccination. How do you engage with people if you can't basically agree about the kind of fundamental facts? Any wisdom that you have, any of you, please, on that as a general point?
there's a small church that's recently begun that Brooklyn Baptist Church has a kind of an umbrella around a mission partnership, we've called it. And there are a number within that fellowship who are alternative thinkers around vaccines, masks, but one of them sends me an article every day on Messenger, something from YouTube to watch, or an article from a scientist that's proving that COVID doesn't actually exist, and so on. And it's quite kind of, extreme stuff. And so I'm telling you about this, but I'm going to be disappointing now and say that I haven't yet worked out what I'm going to do with this. It's kind of quite isolated. It's not affecting the rest of even that small fellowship, and it's certainly not affecting BBC. But I'm at a loss at the moment to know how to engage with that. But that's an example of what you're describing.
Yeah. Thank you, Steve. Here's a great question from Mark Edwards. So his question to each of you in turn, please, starting perhaps with Jenny, is why do you each do the job you do, given that you are exposed to criticism and insults? I guess the thought here is that, if we were to choose roles where you're likely to come up against that sort of thing, the three of you have made brilliant choices in that respect, because your front line is contested and is likely to be an area where you personally will experience attack, disagreement, etc., etc. Jenny, what's your answer to that question?
My first answer is to laugh, because I ask myself that quite often. Why do I do this? But seriously, I think it is something actually I have genuinely really struggled with. I find it really hard, and I think that's challenged me, because I look at people in sort of more maybe public positions and think, well, they get what they get because they've chosen that role, and that just comes with the territory. And then suddenly when you're in a sort of similar position, it's really horrible and it's really hard. And what keeps me going with it really is to know that I am where God wants me to be. He gives me the skills to deal with that. He gives me the strength to cope with it. I've learned loads through that. It's massively built my resilience, more than I could ever have possibly imagined. And actually, I'm so incredibly passionate about what I do. So I love my job. It's a very roller coaster job. So when people often say to me, oh, do you enjoy your job? I say that's just completely the wrong word for it. I have massive highs where things are amazing, and I have some very, very difficult lows. But actually, I'm so passionate about education, about working with teenagers in particular. I love working with that age group, and just being part of people's lives at that really difficult time. And actually what I've really also developed is a love for working with staff and developing others, so developing people. And actually the love and the enjoyment and the joy that I get from that overrides the difficult times. And I think just the experience of coping with those situations and knowing how to handle it, each time it gets a little bit easier, I think.
Thank you, Jenny. I suppose part of the role of a teacher is to help in the formation of children, of students, in order that they might be able to deal with conflict in healthy ways. Steve,
Similarly,
as a pastor, what's your take on this? Why do you do what you do?
It's calling. It's knowing in my gut that God has called me into what I do. And every pastor, and I'm sure every teacher and every politician gets those days where you think, I want to do something else now. I want out. But what I come back to is, but God, you called me by name for this. And then if I dig into that a little bit more, it's about being dearly loved and deeply held by God. It's that reality that's at the baseline, if you like, and so you kind of carry on. But I'd also say, like Jenny, I love my job. I do, and I love the people that. Let me say, I have come to love them, the church community, and some of the best moments for me are when when we get people to come up for communion. Sometimes that's been the pattern for us, and just looking at people coming for the bread and the wine and thinking about what God's doing in their lives and the challenges they're facing and the ups and the downs. There's just something just so precious about that, such a privilege. So there are some nasty bits, some scrapes, but yeah, it's about calling. And I'm sure that Jenny, you would also use the word calling, and Stephen, you would also use that. That's not unique to a church vocation, is it? That it's God calling us in to that.
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. Talk to us about that. Your sense of calling. Is that why you do what you do?
Yeah, I'd very much agree with the way Steve's expressed that. I mean, people do ask me this question a fair amount. Particularly, I got stabbed 10 years ago or 11 years ago, and a lot of people said then, why on earth do you carry on? But I love the job as well, and there is lots of criticism, but actually, I would say there's more kind of appreciation for my efforts amongst my constituents than there is criticism, and I really value that feedback and enjoy the job no end. And you do kind of feel as an MP there are some things you can do, some things you can achieve, and that's a very satisfying part of the job.
Thank you. I was reading with our children this morning the words of Jesus when he talks about if you want to be my disciple, you must take up your cross and follow me. And I'm struck by in what you're saying that there is this sense of calling and joy and where you are fulfilling that and being fully alive, and at the same time recognizing that part of our calling to intentional discipleship, serious discipleship, is that involves sacrifice and can involve suffering, and that's something that we do with our eyes open. We that's what it means to follow Jesus, to pick up your cross and to follow. And so there's a question here from Stephen Harvey about the role of enduring suffering in the context of fighting Christianly. Do you have any thoughts on that, Steve Elms?
Yeah, it's just part of the deal, isn't it? It's a distinctive part of the Christian journey, is that you're going to suffer, and some bits of this are just going to be really hard. Just as it's also part of the journey that we will be brought to repentance, and that all of this is really countercultural. I was struck this morning, I'm probably slightly off track here, by Pope Francis' recent pronouncement for the month of March, where he talks about the sacrament of reconciliation and confession, and just the gift of being able to come to a merciful God and to know mercy for our lack and for our sin. And yeah, again, that's all very countercultural, but it's part of the deal, isn't it? That kind of daily confession. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. Go on, Jenny, please.
I was just going to add something about the suffering question, if that's okay. Just about the fact that you do learn through those times, and those hard times in life really do build you, and I think you learn that as you go through as well. They're horrible at the time, but actually when you reflect on those times, they're often the times when you've learned the most, and that your walk with God has often been the closest as well. So I think that gives me a big sense of hope and peace during those times, that I know that that's not going to be forever, and that I know actually that I will learn from that situation.
Yeah. Jenny, thank you panel so much. This has been such an inspiring evening. One of my favorite quotes from one of my favorite theologians, Irenaeus, is the glory of God is seen in a human being fully alive. And as I've listened to you, and I'm sure as everyone here this evening's listened to you, you are fully alive. You are in serving God on your front lines as disciples of Jesus, and that makes a world of difference, not least to the people you interact with, and is so significant. And the way you talked us through conflict, how you face it, the way you've been open about some of the struggles that you've had, and the way that you've pointed us in the direction of some good examples and resources to help us as we seek to navigate conflict has been brilliant. So thank you so very much. Ladies and gentlemen, please, if you may be on mute, it doesn't matter, but perhaps you would like to show your appreciation in the usual way. We're so grateful to our panel this evening.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. I'd like, if I may, to pray for the three of you and also us, and then just say a couple of closing things. But we're so grateful to you for being with us, for taking the time. This is a busy time, so thank you so much. Let me pray for you. Thank you. Lord, we are inspired and we're challenged and encouraged by what we've heard this evening. We thank you for the extraordinary strategic work that Jenny and Steve and Stephen are engaged in. Thank you that in different ways they have listened to your voice and responded obediently to it. Thank you that they are living as disciples of Jesus in their school and church and community, in their constituency and in the Houses of Parliament. Thank you for the wisdom that they have, and thank you for all that they have given of themselves in serving in this way. And thank you for the way they have sought to deal with conflict and disagreement in ways that has integrity and always recognizes the innate value of the personal people that they're disagreeing with, created as they are, as we all are, in the image of God. And so we pray that you will resource them, fill them with your spirit, equip them to serve you where they are in their everyday. And we pray that in these coming days, they will experience a renewed sense of vocation, a renewed vision, and great encouragement. For we ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Amen.